All right, good morning. Welcome to the last in our training series on LDEQ's recap. This is the ins and outs of the VRP. This was supposed to be webinar number 4, but it ended up being number 5, thanks to Hurricane Ida. Just some introductions. My name is Rebecca Oddie. I'm the Brownfield coordinator here at LDEQ. So my job is to help with outreach and letting people know about the Brownfields and VRP program, helping sites through that process. Jennifer Schatzel, who is our speaker today, she's our Brownfields technical liaison. She's the one who actually knows the ins and outs of all the regulatory programs and helps our Brownfield and VRP sites through that process. And then we also have Dwayne Wilson, who's our Brownfields advisor. He's been around for quite a while, knows both programs in and out, and provides some assistance in just facilitating that process. So the goal of this recap training series is to facilitate the environmental investigation and cleanup of sites to expedite their reuse. That's really the goal of the Brownfield program, is to help take vacant and abandoned properties and get them ready for reuse. Whether that's through something that's a community benefit like a park or a healthcare clinic, or something that's going to create some income like rental housing or commercial. That's the goal of the Brownfield program. So we wanted to host this recap training series, both for LDEQ team leaders and for environmental consultants and anybody that's one of our Brownfield stakeholders, just to better understand our regulatory process and help facilitate those sites through. And then obviously that translates over to LDEQ's traditional sites as well. We want to get those through the regulatory process as quickly as possible as well. All right, so if you have questions today, please related to the presentation, please make sure to put those in the Q&A. That way we can keep track of them all and make sure that they all get answered. We'll also pause a couple times and you can raise your hand if you want to ask a question verbally. And then you can also use the chat box. We recommend you only use the chat box for things like you're having problems hearing or something technical related. If you have questions, just make sure to use those for, put those in the Q&A. For course credit or certificate of attendance, you do have to attend the majority of the webinar. You need to answer the poll questions, which means you need to be logged into your Zoom account or have it be underneath your name. So when we pull it up, the poll question answers come up underneath your name. For LDEQ folks, as long as you meet the minimum requirements, your information will be sent to Jared, as long as you provided that your P number when you registered. Non-LDEQ folks, when we send out the link for the recording, you'll just reply back to that and you can request a certificate and we can send that over to you. Okay, just as I mentioned, this recording will be posted on YouTube. If you go Google LDEQ YouTube is the easiest way to get there. If you go to playlists, you'll see there's a 2021 recap training playlist. All of the trainings are posted underneath there. Here's our standard disclaimer. If you've been with us for the other ones, you know that we include this in. Basically what this is saying, every site is unique. So this is just for general information, but always talk to your team leader or to your supervisor for site-specific information. We're just providing this for general information today. So LDEQ's recap, that stands for Risk Evaluation Corrective Action Program. The current regulation, still the 2003 version. We are in the process of updating that. That kind of got put on hold due to COVID. The next step is to do some community outreach with it. So we're still operating underneath the 2003 version. One of the things we're going to kind of emphasize during this training, even though we're talking about the VRP, when you do the data analysis part of it, you're still using the recap regulations for that. It's still, it's the same. There's not different regulations for VRP versus recap. It's all recap. Okay. One of the things we kind of wanted to go over, because there is some confusion between what is traditionally called a recap investigation, which we're going to call a non-VRP investigation, and a VRP investigation. So one that's a traditional site, the investigation focuses on areas where you think there's contamination, whether you've documented that or not. You've got drums in one spot, you've got a UST in another, you're going to sample there. And what you analyze for is based on, okay, these drums we think had sulfuric acid, and these tanks we think we had hydrocarbons. You're going to kind of sample around that. And if it goes off site, if your tank leaked and it keeps going, you've got to keep sampling. If it's a VRP investigation, you're going to sample for what you think is there, still your drums, still your tanks, but then you're also going to define the boundaries of your site, and you're going to sample across that whole site. And in addition to what you think is there, you're also going to sample for volatiles, semi-volatiles, metals, and TPH. So that's kind of the difference. In the VRP investigation, you're just collecting a lot more samples. When it gets to the analysis part, again, all the same kind of analysis, you just have more data to work with underneath the VRP. And Jennifer is going to go over this in detail. This is something that we found people get confused with, so we really wanted to emphasize this. When it comes to the remediation, if you're underneath our traditional program, the areas to be remediated are based on the results of that investigation. You have to remediate all the risks, and you can't normally put in engineering institutional controls, whereas with the VRP remediation, it can be tailored to the intended future use of the site, and you might be able to use engineering institutional controls. So you have to do more investigation up front for the VRP, but you have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to the cleanup. And then at the end of the day, for a non-VRP site, you get a no further action at this time letter from LDEQ, which, if standards change in the future or something else changes, LDEQ might be able to come back to you and open that back up. Underneath the VRP, you can get a certificate of completion for the site and a release of liability for all past contamination. And that's for any applicant that's listed in your application. And so for some of these sites where people are really hesitant to let go of them because they are afraid of liability, this can be a really good incentive for them to go through this program, go through the VRP, and get that release of liability, and then they can, let go of the site and let it become something different and be redeveloped. So the other thing I wanted just to touch on real quick before we get into our presentation, people also get a little confused between brownfields and VRP. So now I didn't actually know this until I actually got to DEQ. So EPA made it a condition that in order for a state to receive brownfields funding, they had to create this voluntary remediation program. They really wanted to address the liability issues that prevent so many brownfield sites from moving forward. So a brownfield site is any vacant and abandoned property where the reuse of that site is complicated by environmental concerns. That's all it has to be in order to be a brownfield site. And then the brownfield funding, the brownfields in general, though, is just really the funding mechanism. It's just the money. So when we talk about a brownfield site, it's either that general concept of it's vacant and abandoned and environmental uses are preventing it from being reused, or we're talking about brownfields funding, which is just funding, and that can be paying for a traditional non-VRP site or a VRP investigation. The voluntary remediation program is really something that's separate. It is a regulatory program that gives you that release of liability. So they're really, two separate things, but LDEQ just has to have that VRP program in order to be eligible for Brownfields funding. So that's how they're kind of connected together. Okay, so that brings us to our first poll question. Let me go ahead and bring that up. All right. So our first poll question is just to give us an idea of how you've been involved with the VRP site in the past. Your options: yes, I worked on a VRP site, either an investigation or a cleanup, or you had a site that was enrolled in the VRP. You've been somewhat involved. You kind of know somebody or somebody else at your agency had a VRP site and they, talked about it at a lunch and learn, been somewhat involved in that. No, but you've learned about the VRP in the past, or you're just learning about the VRP for the first time, or none of those apply, and you can add those details in the chat. So just trying to get a feel for where people are. All right. Oh, good. People are quick this morning. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. Oh, good. We've got about 40% that have worked on one in the past. 37% that have learned about it in the past, and then everybody else is kind of split. So really great smattering today, and hopefully we'll answer a lot of your questions as we go along. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce Jennifer Schatzel and turn things over to her. So Jennifer, as I mentioned, is our Brownfields and VRP technical liaison. She also worked as an environmental consultant for many years on the private sector, including working on Brownfield sites, voluntary remediation program sites, and a lot of varied different experience. She came over to DEQ about 3-4 years ago. And has been helping facilitate a lot of the Brownfield sites, not only the ones that through LDEQ's Brownfield program, but also through our local Brownfield programs, and then also assisting with the voluntary remediation program sites as well. I will say we haven't had as many of those sites in. We're hoping this training changes that, so people will not be as worried about entering it in, and they will also recognize going to Jennifer, she's such a great resource for answering questions and demystifying the process and walking you through. So we're really lucky to have her here. And with that, Jennifer, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Rebecca. Well, good morning. So welcome to the ins and outs of the voluntary remediation program. So with the presentation, we just hope to give you a little information on the Louisiana Voluntary Remediation Program, the VRP. And we want to go kind of through the steps that are associated with it, and then discuss some of the advantages and aspects of it. So like Rebecca said, our goal, we want to give you enough information to help you at least decide, or maybe at least consider projects that you have if they could benefit from entering the VRP. So once again, if you have any questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll stop periodically and we'll try to answer them. Next. Okay, so the purpose of the VRP is to allow an applicant or applicants to receive a release of liability from all past contamination at a site. So upon completion of the program, the applicant, you're issued a certificate of completion, which spells out this release of liability. So I'll probably kind of use those two interchangeably, certificate of completion or release of liability. But as Rebecca said, the VRP was created to encourage brownfield redevelopment by providing another tool to assist prospective purchasers, developers, and investors in managing liability issues when you're dealing with a contaminated site. So this is a state program. So completion of this program provides a release of state liability for further cleanup costs at a site to address past contamination. However, though, in 2004, the state did negotiate a memorandum of understanding with EPA Region 6, and that stated that US EPA will also respect the issuance of release of liability under that federal statutes. So with that MOA, now the release of liability is good for federal and state. Another perk of this program is that this release of a liability, it applies to the applicants as well as their successors, and it flows to any future buyers, developers, or lenders. Next. So the VRP is a very prescriptive process. That means there are certain steps and requirements that are defined in our statutes and in our regulations, and they must be followed in order to receive the certificate of completion. So these requirements can be found in the Louisiana Revised Statutes, Title 30, Subtitle 2, Chapter 12, Part 2, and then also in Chapter 9 of our Inactive and Abandoned Sites Regulations, which those are found at LAC 33, Part 6. So we'll discuss these steps and requirements a little later in the webinar. So the main caveat with the VRP is that to receive the certificate of completion, a remedy or remedial action must be performed pursuant to an approved work plan. As we'll discuss later, the program does allow non-responsible parties to perform partial remediations where waste may be left in place and exposure can be managed through engineering or institutional controls. However, to receive that certificate of completion and release liability, some type of remedy still must be conducted as proposed in that approved work plan. An applicant can't just propose to manage exposure through institutional controls or through pre-existing engineering controls. Something must be proposed and then conducted. Next. Okay, so before we dive into the process, let's just talk about who and what can participate in this program. So regarding site eligibility, any site is eligible to be entered into the VRP unless they are, one, a permitted hazardous waste unit. Now, if the hazardous waste unit is part of a larger site, the rest of the site is eligible, just not the portion within the hazardous waste management unit boundaries. That would have to be excluded. Also, sites that have been proposed to the NPL or sites that have been placed on the NPL are not eligible. Now, if the site was previously proposed or placed, but has since been removed or delisted, it is eligible for the VRP. Also, if the site is eligible for a motor fuel trust fund, then it is not eligible to be remediated under the VRP. And then finally, sites that have pending environmental enforcement actions related to the contamination that would be addressed under the VRP are not eligible. However, if that enforcement action is only related to cost recovery, then they could be eligible. Okay, next. Okay, so now what persons are eligible to participate as an applicant in the VRP? Well, the answer is everybody. This includes non-responsible persons as well as people who would be considered responsible parties or responsible for the contamination that's present at site. Either can apply. But the difference is a responsible person has to remediate the site to recap standards. They cannot leave any contamination in place. However, non-responsible parties are available to conduct a partial remediation. This is where we do allow contamination above recap standards to remain in place, provided it doesn't allow exposure based on the future planned use of the site. So we'll get a little more into the partial remediation a little bit later. I guess right now I want to talk a bit about responsible persons. So the definition of a responsible person under the VRP statute, it's different than the statute that governs our typical sites. So under Part 1 of Chapter 12, which is our statute that usually our typical brownfield sites are regulated under. Under that, a responsible person is any person who transports or directly contracts for the transportation of a hazardous substance or waste to a pollution source or facility, a generator of the waste present at the site, someone who directly discharges or disposes of a hazardous substance or waste at the site, or an owner, operator, or lessee. So under Part 1, this applies to current owners, even if they did not cause the contamination or own the property at the time it was contaminated, they can still be considered a responsible person. Next. So under our VRP statute, which is Part 2 of Chapter 12, responsible persons include, just like as in Part 1, transporters of waste, generators of waste, persons who disposed or directly discharged of the waste at the site. However, unlike under Part 1, an owner is only considered a responsible person if they meet the following criteria. Next. So under the VRP, an owner is only considered a responsible party if they knowingly permitted a person to make regular use of the property for disposal of waste, if they themselves engaged in the business of generating, transporting, storing, treating, or disposing of a hazardous substance or hazardous waste on the property, or knowingly permitted others to engage in such a business, if they knowingly permitted any person to use the property for disposal of a hazardous substance. Next. If they knew or reasonably should have known that the hazardous substance was located on the property when they first acquired it, and they engaged in conduct that would associate them with the discharge or disposal. And then finally, if they took action which significantly contributed to the discharge or disposal after they knew or reasonably should have known that it was located on the property. So under the VRP, even if you are a current owner of a contaminated property, unless any of these would apply to you, then you would not be considered a responsible party. Okay.
All right, that brings us to our next poll question. Oh. And there we go. All right, so our next poll question, who is eligible to apply for the VRP? And this is a select all that apply. Non-responsible parties, responsible parties, property owner, developer, local municipality, community group, or anyone, any entity. And if you do have any questions about the eligibility of a site or the eligibility of an applicant, feel free to put those in the Q&A. Also know, Jennifer, Dwayne, and I, we are here well after this webinar. So if you have a site that comes through, that comes across your desk and you think it might be eligible for the VRP, but you're not sure, always come back and talk to us and ask us, and we can walk you through this as well. All right, so we have about 75% of folks that have responded. We are going to give you just a few more seconds to respond. All right, you have about 10 more seconds to submit. So if you haven't submitted anything yet, go ahead and make your best guess so we can at least document that you were still with us at this point in the webinar. You have about 10 more seconds left. All right, we're going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. So if you clicked on any of them, you are correct. Anyone, any entity is eligible to apply with some of the caveats for the responsible parties. So good job with that. And I will pass it back to.
All right, thanks. Yeah, and sorry if my voice has gone out. I have a little frog in my throat this morning, but okay, so let's go ahead and kind of go through the process of the VRP. We'll begin with the applications. So in order to enter the program, an application must be submitted along with an applicable fee and work plan. We have 2 phases in the program. Each of them have their own application form. So the first phase is the investigation form, and the application form is VCP 001. Rebecca, would you be able to pull that up?
Yes, I'm working on it right now.
All right. Just kind of, it's a fairly easy form. It's short. I think it's 4 or 5 pages. So just kind of wanted to go through it real quick. All right, there. And if you can just scroll down a little bit. Yeah, you put the applicant information. You can have co-applicants. It's not limited to just one applicant. If you have investors and a developer and the owner all want to be on the same application, that is fine. And then go to the next page.
Yeah, we often, for brownfield sites, have funders that want to be included as well.
Right. So, and then just the current property owner if he's not included in the applicants. And then, yeah, and then after that, it's just giving us some site information. Most important thing here, that legal property description. I see this very often. It's the thing most people forget, or they just submit section township range information. We need a true legal property description because that is what is identifying your VRP site. So something descriptive that, excludes any right-of-ways or things like that must be included. If you can't fit it here, if it comes with the survey and everything else, you can just attach it. Please check and let us know that it's attached, and don't forget to attach it to the end of the application. So other than that, it's just a little bit of description of what was the property used for, what are you planning on using it, what does the surrounding property look like, and then contaminants that you believe are there. Also, please submit any phase 1 or phase 2 or investigations that you have associated with the property. Submit those with this unless for some reason we already have them. And then finally, this is just certifying that it is eligible, that it's not any of the things I discussed earlier. And that is about it. So fairly simple application. Okay, you can go back to the PowerPoint, Rebecca. Okay, so like I said, to enter the investigation phase, the applicant must submit the application form, the $500 application fee, and the voluntary remedial investigation work plan, which we'll talk about in a bit. Upon completion, so once you complete the investigation phase, this is when you can enter the second phase, which is the remedial action phase. For this phase, we have another application form, VCP 002. It's very similar, pretty much the same as the VCP 001, but you'd include that, the $500 fee. You'd include your voluntary remediation action plan, And you also have to include the previously approved voluntary remediation investigation report. So that's all part of that package. I know we've mentioned this. If an applicant intends on doing a partial remediation, there is a spot on the action application to check. And then you also have to submit the supplemental form, the partial remediation supplemental form. It's VCP 003. And pretty much this form just documents and certifies that the applicant is a non-responsible party based on the criteria that we talked about earlier. So one more form we have, as with our typical non-VRP sites, we track LDEQ personnel oversight costs for VRP sites, and those are invoiced to the applicant. The application fee, that $500, is actually credited to this and covers the first $500 of oversight costs. However, non-responsible government and qualified nonprofits can apply for a waiver from oversight cost. They still have to submit that $500 fee, but they will not be charged for any additional oversight cost up to a maximum of $5,000. So if you want to apply for that, there is also a form for it, and it must be submitted with each of the applications. Okay, Rebecca? So all of these application forms can be found on the VRP page that is on the LDEQ website. I think Rebecca's recently updated, so it's all up to date and looks nice. It includes a detailed discussion of the process, and it has links to the statutes and regulations, as well as this handy little flow chart that you see to the right, and it to help you keep the process straight. If you can see it, the flow chart depicts the process for both phases. The left side is the investigation phase, and the right side describes the remedial phase. So as we mentioned earlier, the VRP, it's a very prescriptive process, and there are a lot of steps that must be followed per the regulations in order to receive that COC. So I highly encourage you to refer to this flow chart when you're working on a VRP project. It just helps you keep these steps straight, know what's next, and just make sure nothing gets missed. All right. All right, so we'll start with the process. The first step for a new project is to submit the voluntary remedial investigation application and the investigation work plan for DEQ review. So I want to talk a little bit about the investigation work plan, as investigations conducted under the VRP are a little different than for non-VRP site investigations. Okay. Next slide. Thanks. All right, so, and I know Rebecca touched on this at the beginning. So under the VRP, the area to be investigated is defined by the applicant, and he does that through the legal description that is provided in that application. Now you decide the property that you want in there. If you have a large parcel of property, but you're only concerned with getting a COC on a portion of it, because maybe only a portion of it was previously developed or something like that, you can survey that portion that you want the COC to apply to and use that for the legal description, submit that. So another thing under the VRP investigations, off-site investigation is not required. Once again, this release of liability only applies to the VRP site. So for the VRP investigation, we are only concerned with the area within the VRP site boundaries. Now, this does not mean you do not have to address that off-site contamination if you're a responsible party. It just means that that would be done outside of the VRP program. The off-site contamination is still subject to our other statutes and regulations. Next. All right, so Another thing, because the state is granting this release of liability, we do tend to require more thorough investigation to help ensure that all discharges or disposals at the site have been identified and characterized. So at a minimum, we require an expanded list of constituents to be analyzed. And the minimum amount include the total petroleum hydrocarbons, which I always suggest analyzing for the fractions rather than the GD or O. You just get better data, and usually with GD and O, you have to go back and do the fractions anyway. Also, our volatiles, semi-volatiles, and metals. Now, based on the history and other information we have about the site, other parameters may be added, such as PCBs or pesticides. So the VRP investigation work plan must also include the site investigation requirements in recap. Once again, everything is being done under recap, just you're getting a little more samples, you're gathering more data, you're just investigating the site itself a bit more than a traditional site. Okay, next. All right, so once again, here's just a summary kind of to emphasize this. So for non-VRP sites, the AOI is defined by the delineation of the impacted media, and that's irrespective of property boundaries. If contamination extends off-site for a non-VRP site, it's still delineated, even if that means sampling off-site. However, under the VRP, the only concern is within the property boundaries of the VRP site defined in the application. So the AOI only needs to be defined up to the property boundary. No need to sample off-site. Another difference, under a typical site investigation, sample parameters can be identified just based on the history or based on what was released at the site. Example, if you have a release of gasoline under a non-VRP investigation, you would just be looking for gasoline-related constituents. However, under the VRP, we require a broader list of analytes to give more surety that all releases have been identified and get a better picture of property conditions. Finally, and I'm not sure I really touched on this yet, for a non-VRP site, sample locations are based on just defining that AOI and kind of looking at places where that could be potential sources. So you're doing more judgment sampling. But under VRP, not only are the sample locations based on defining an AOI or based on where you think there may have been releases, but will also include locations throughout the site, as once again, we want to get a good picture of everything, of the conditions of the entire site. Okay, next. So I just got a few examples of some sampling plans from some previous VRP site. This is a site in Lafayette. So the purple area in the southeast corner was a former Coca-Cola bottling plant. North of that were small warehouses. And then on the west side was a former motel. So now, even though the motel did not really have any environmental concerns that are associated with it, because the applicant wanted to include this as part of the VRP site, that area was investigated as well and included some sample locations there. As you can see, everything stayed on site within the property boundary, which is that darker blue line. Down in the southeast corner, after the initial excavation, we did have some exceedances in that area. And so some additional delineation borings were done. That was more to kind of help plan the remediation and see where the remedy needed to go. But as you can tell, none of those borings went off site. It was all just confined to on the property. Okay, next. All right, here's another one we have. This is an old railroad yard site that's about 10 acres. So for this site, the SB locations that you see Those were actually from a previous investigation that was done outside of the VRP. A little bit of remediation was done, some excavation near SB5, and the site did get an NFA, just outside of the VRP. However, fast forward a few years, the owner decided they did want that certificate of completion and liability protection to help further redevelopment. So they went ahead and entered the site in the VRP. So some additional sampling was needed. The sampling plan was set up, that's these P samples, was set up kind of in a grid pattern to be able to characterize the entire site. It also included some additional analytes, as not all analysis had been done under the previous investigations. So once again, everything within the property boundaries. So just kind of an examples of how we want to see, you know, covering the whole site and sampling locations. All right, next. All right, so let's go to the next steps in the flow chart. So the investigation work plan has been submitted and approved by LDEQ, and we're now ready to implement it. Once the results from the investigation are received, they're submitted to DEQ as part of the Voluntary Remediation Investigation Report. So the main objective of the investigation report is to show that the nature and extent of the contamination at the VRP site has been defined. The site is then evaluated in a recap, and data is compared to the appropriate recap standards. So if concentrations are above recap standards, remediation will be required, and that can be done through either entering the next phase of the VRP, the remedial action phase, or for some reason, if you want to do it outside of the VRP program, it can be done there too. Now, if all the concentrations are below the recap standard at this point, then an NFA is issued, not a COC, just a normal NFA. So as we mentioned in the beginning, in order to get that COC, a remedy must be conducted per an approved remedial action work plan. So if you end up with something like this, if the goal is to get a COC, that liability protection is wanted, you may want to consider how you do your recap evaluation. For example, you find that all the COC concentrations would be below the recap MO1 standards, but you want to get that COC. So then you may only want to evaluate the data to screening option. So that way you do have some exceedances, and therefore you would have something to clean up or address in your remedial action work plan. Okay, next. Oh, poll question.
All right, so we're back up to our next poll question. Go ahead and launch it. All right, so the next poll question: who defines the boundaries of a VRP site? Is it the team leader, the assistant secretary, the local assessor's office, or the VRP applicant? Who actually defines what the boundaries of the site are? And while people are entering that in, just a couple of notes on the one site that Jennifer brought up, that railroad site. So the railroad actually sold the property to somebody, but there was a condition of the sale that it could not be used for residential use because the railroad was concerned about liability. And I don't think that the new owner read the document as clearly as he thought, and thought that he could get rid of that, and he could not. So he negotiated with the railroad to enter the site into the VRP, yet that released the liability for them. And then they were comfortable with removing that condition that it could now be used for residential property. So that's, one of the tools of the VRP is just to get those property owners that are concerned about liability to let go of those sites and let them be redeveloped. And then we also had another site that had some contamination, zinc contamination in the groundwater. Somebody purchased the site, and if we had screened everything, to an MO1 standard, it would have gone away, but we wouldn't have had anything to clean up. So we actually chose, to go with screening standards. There was a little bit of contamination that we could clean up in the soil, and then also do the conveyance notice not to use the groundwater. And they were able to get that certificate of completion for the site as a whole. So just different ways that you can use the VRP in order to move these sites forward. All right, it looks about 78% of folks have participated. We're going to give you about 10 more seconds to make a choice, and then we're going to go ahead and end the poll. So if you haven't already, go ahead and make your selection. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end the poll. All right, most of you got it correct. It is the VRP applicant. They are the ones who define the boundaries of the site. Make sure to include that in your application, and you can be very descriptive in those site boundaries, because that's what, as Jennifer mentioned, you'll get your release of liability for. All right, and I'll pass it back to Jennifer.
Sorry, forgot to unmute. Okay. All right, well, let's move on to the next section. Start with the beginning of the remedial action phase. So upon approval of your voluntary remedial investigation report, you're done with the investigation phase. So you're technically not in the VRP program anymore. So to enter into the remedial phase, you have to submit the voluntary remediation action application, which once again includes that application form, the VCP 002, the remedial action work plan, and a copy of the approved investigation report needs to accompany all that. And that if there were any revisions or comments that were subject to the approval, that all needs to be incorporated into the investigation report that is submitted with the application. So also at this time, this is when the decision needs to be made whether this is going to be a complete or partial remediation, if the applicant's eligible for partial. So if it is a partial application, the partial application form must be included as well. And also for that remedial action plan, the use restrictions that are being proposed should be clearly identified in the work plan that is submitted. A draft copy of the partial remediation agreement, which is also required for that, should also be submitted to LDEQ for review. And we have boilerplate language for the partial remediation agreements that we give you and for review and filling out. Okay, so next, Rebecca. All right, so let's talk about the remedial actions, and mostly let's talk about complete remediation versus partial remediation. So for a complete remediation, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty much the same as cleanups conducted outside of the VRP. Any contamination above recap standards must be remediated. You can't leave contamination on site. No use restrictions other than just our typical conveyance notice for sites remediated to industrial standards can be used. And just reminder, once again, if the applicant is considered a responsible party, they can only do a complete remediation. Okay, next. However, so for partial remediations, contamination may be left on site if it is protective of the planned future use of the site. The remaining contamination can be managed with use restrictions that would need to be recorded in the title records. Also, under the partial, we allow engineering controls to be used to prevent exposure. So for example, for a partial remediation, if groundwater is impacted above recap standards, however, based on the future plan use, there would be no exposure to the groundwater. It would not be necessary to remediate the groundwater. The applicant would just need to include restrictions on use of the groundwater beneath the site and record that in the conveyance notices with that language in the title records. Okay, next. So as I mentioned, for a voluntary remedial action plan that involves a partial remediation, the proposed use restrictions must be clearly identified in the remedial action plan. It is important to note, and this is just for planning in the future, these use restrictions cannot be modified, canceled, or removed unless the site is further remediated to completely remove or remedy the remaining contamination. So that's just something to remember in moving forward after the COC has been issued. So also under a partial remediation, if engineering controls are proposed, a monitoring and maintenance plan for post-remedial management will likely be needed. And that will help define the inspection schedule and process and include any maintenance requirements that may be needed for the engineering controls. So at a minimum, inspections are required to be submitted by the owner or developer of the property and should be conducted and reported to DEQ on a semi-annual basis. So as I mentioned to you, for a partial remediation, a draft partial remediation agreement must also be submitted to DEQ for review. Okay, next. Talk about these the partial remediation agreement a bit. So this is something that must be signed by the property owner. And pretty much since contamination will be left on site, the property owner must agree to allow future access to investigate and remediate the remaining discharges if so needed. Also, the property owner must agree to not take any actions that would aggravate the remaining contamination or do anything that may interfere with future remedial actions. So my thought, for example, if a property owner knows that there's shallow contamination in the upper aquifer and decides to install pilings through the contaminated area and it drags the contamination now into a deeper aquifer, now it's in spread, and so that property owner has violated the partial remediation agreement and would be no longer eligible for that release of liability. So also, if there is a viable responsible party, they are still responsible for the remaining contamination. We have one site that's going through the VRP now by a non-responsible person who's looking to redevelop it. However, the site was contaminated by a dry cleaner next door, and they have been actively remediating the site. So, but the new non-responsible person still wanted to get it developed even during the remediation. So at the beginning of the process, we had to make the applicant understand that he can't interfere with the remediation. So that just kind of included his consideration of, locations of businesses and where he was going to put things, and also including redoing the monitoring wells and making sure they were still accessible as part of the remedial action plan. So it's just something to consider and think through when you're going through this process. Okay, next. Okay, and as we mentioned a few times, under a partial remediation, the owner of the site is also required to impose and record restrictions on the future uses of the site. These use restrictions must be identified in the remedial action plan for LDEQ review and approval. Once the remedy has been completed, the use restrictions will be included in a conveyance notice and filed with the land records at the parish clerk of court. The partial remediation agreement is also filed with those land records too. All right, next. Okay, so back to the remedial action. So regardless if it's a partial or complete remediation, in order to obtain a COC, an active remedy must be proposed in the remedial action plan, meaning something has to be done or constructed. Examples can include excavation of impacted soil, construction of an engineering control such as an impermeable barrier, or removal of a potential source such as an underground storage tank or a free product. And this is if all concentrations are, and this is kind of what we touched on before, this is, you have to find something to clean up. So you may want to use more conservative recap standards just in order for you to be able to identify something to clean up, and then you can still qualify for the COC. Okay, next. All right, moving on. You have submitted your voluntary remediation application and work plan. So DEQ will review it, and when we find it to be acceptable and contain all the necessary information we need, we will issue a letter indicating that the remedial application is conditionally approved for public notice and comment. So our regulations and statutes have some specific wording regarding the public notice requirements. So I just kind of want to go over those real quick. Next. So first of all, with the public notice requirements is the accepted application, which includes the application form, the remedial action plan, and that improved investigation report, must be placed somewhere and made available for review by the public. So typically, what I've seen, the local library is the most common place that is used. You can just leave them at the front desk and they know if anyone asks to allow them to look at it. But honestly, it could, depending where you are, it could be a government office or just anywhere that the public would have access. We do have to approve first where you're proposing to put these copies, just to make sure we agree that the public would have access. Okay, next. So next with our requirements, the applicant must notify the contiguous landowners as listed in the assessor's roll of the availability of this plan for review. So these notifications have to be sent by certified mail, and these receipts must be provided to DEQ as documentation before we can issue final approval. So the next thing with public comment, the applicant must post a public notice in the local newspaper of general circulation, once again, that the remedial application is available for review and for comment. Now, this notice only needs to be published once, and the day it's published, that's the day that begins the comment period. The comment period is typically 30 days. However, it can be adjusted shorter or longer based on if need be by DEQ. Now, the notice, the public notice must be a minimum size of 4 inches by 6 inches. So this is in the regulations. So make sure to let the newspaper know this when submitting the notice information that there is a size requirement. We do have we have a typical template for the public notice language that we will send along with the conditional approval for the public comment letter, so that you can use that. Proof of publication must be submitted to the DEQ. Typically, the newspaper can provide an affidavit of publication, but you do usually have to ask for it and specifically request it. And sometimes I believe there might be an extra fee associated with it. So that's the public comment requirements. Once the comment period is complete and DEQ has received the public notice documentation, and also we've had a chance to make sure any comments have come in and then also address them if need be. Once all that's done, LDEQ can issue final approval to implement the remedial action plan. Okay.
I'm going to chime in here just to give Jenna a chance to get a drink of water too.
Thank you.
I just wanted to make sure you to note it does say certified mail. That is not FedEx, not UPS, not hand delivered. It has to be certified mail with those little green receipt things. So make sure to note that. And then before you, for those of you who are environmental consultants, make sure that you send the language for the public notice to your team leader first and have them approve it before you send it into the newspaper. And for those of you who are team leaders, make sure to read through it, make sure they have the required information. The first couple that you do, you can also run by Jennifer and just say, hey, I think this looks okay, or I think they need to add in this. What do you think? And I think once you do that a couple times, you'll have a good feel for what needs to go in there and then be able to approve it. But for those of you who are consultants, make sure that whatever you send out to the contiguous landowners, DEQ approves of that, and then, or your team leader at least has a chance to look at it. And then for the public notice, that your team leader approves that language before you spend the money and post it or waste the time. Because if it's not correct, if it's not the right size, you will have to repost it in the newspaper, and that's going to cost you time as well as money. So just, make sure to be aware of that.
Yeah, especially with getting the language right. Like I said, we have that template, but usually the biggest thing I've seen is that public notice language needs to include the applicant or applicant's name. And that needs to match the remedial the application form too. I know names change and people put contact, names instead of the actual entity, but just make sure all that matches.
Because that's who's going to get the certificate of completion.
Right. And just, no questions, just clean and straight. So, all right, so let's go back to our flow chart. So we've got the comment period is complete. The public documentation notice has been received. Comments have been addressed. LDEQ will now issue the final approval to implement the remedial action plan. So once the implementation is complete and the remedy has been constructed, a remedial action report is then submitted by the applicant to DEQ for review. All right, next. Okay, so the remedial action report, pretty much it just needs to include at a minimum just a general description of the remedial action activities that were conducted. You want it to demonstrate that the remedial goals, which are identified in the remedial action plan, were met through this remedy. And also want to include any documentation of disposal of any waste or impacted media that was removed from the site, and documentation that construction of any physical controls or treatment systems were installed as described in the remedial action plan. Okay, next. All right, so now we are in the home stretch of the process. Before this certificate of completion can be issued, just have a few things that have to be done. First of all, the remediation report must be approved. The conveyance notice, if it was remediated to industrial standards, must be filed with the parish clerk of court, and DEQ must have received that documentation. And then also the final invoice must be paid before the COC can be issued. Now, if you have a partial remediation, we got a couple more things. The partial remediation agreement and the use restriction conveyance notice must have been placed and filed in the conveyance records. Once again, we also must receive that documentation. And also, if a monitoring and maintenance plan is required, it must be approved by DEQ prior to issuing the COC. Okay, next. All right, so ongoing responsibilities, these really mostly only apply to the partial remediations, because once again, with the complete remediation, you're taking everything out above recap standards. But for partial remediations, any The applicants, as well as any future owners or operators or developers, they must comply with the use restrictions, comply with the terms of the operation and maintenance plan for post-remedial management, which this includes the submittal of those semi-annual inspections to DEQ. They must also maintain and keep those engineering controls there. All right, next. Oh, back to a poll.
All right, next poll question. Let me go ahead and launch it. All right, so which of the following are VRP requirements? And you want to select all that apply. So the site boundaries are defined by LDEQ, additional sampling throughout the site beyond just the AOI, a VRP compliant investigation report, a 30-day public notice for the VRP cleanup with a 4x6 ad in the newspaper, a $500 application fee for VRP investigation, a $500 application fee for VRP cleanup, or all of the above. So go ahead and put in your answers for that. While you're doing that, I did want to emphasize, again, the application fees, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a hint here. It is 2 separate fees. So make sure when you're applying, as Jennifer mentioned, those are 2 separate processes. One is the VRP investigation, and then one is the VRP cleanup. So you want to make sure that if you're going through the whole process, you'll have to submit that information twice. And also for the VRP cleanup application, it does say remediation phase or something like that on the application form. We made it very obvious this time to make sure that you knew which one you were submitting, and make sure you're filling out the right application form, just so you don't have to do that twice. All right, it looks like we have about 75% of the folks have submitted. We're gonna give y'all about 10 more seconds to submit. So if you haven't yet, make sure to go ahead and submit something. So that way we have it recorded that you were still with us. And all right, we're gonna go ahead and end the poll. Okay. All right, good smattering of folks. The answer is everything except for the first one. So everything else is required except the first one where it says site boundaries defined by LDEQ. It's a trick question. The site boundaries, again, defined by the applicant. Other than that, everything else is required. So you will have to do some sampling throughout the site, not just around and your AOIs. It does require a VRP compliant investigation report and that public notice for the cleanup, and then both application fee for the investigation and for the cleanup. All right, Jen, I'll pass it back over to you.
All right. Well, all right. So once again, here's my pitch for the advantages of VRP and why it could help your project out. Of course, the main advantage of the program is the release of liability for past contamination that can future owners and successors of the site. People get nervous when dealing with contaminated land. So this release of liability can assist developers and purchasers with alleviating environmental concerns, and it can make a project more attractive to investors or future operators or owners. So another advantage, and this is for the non-responsible parties, is the flexibility in the remediation options. Although the VRP investigation requirements are a bit more thorough and maybe a little more expensive than a typical site investigation, it can help reduce remediation costs by allowing the non-responsible parties to address contamination through engineering controls and institutional controls and use restriction. I think we talked about groundwater contamination. It's usually costly. it takes a long time. So for a non-responsible party looking to purchase and redevelop a site where there is that groundwater contamination, but there are no complete exposure pathways for groundwater based on the proposed use, a partial remediation would allow that to be managed through the use restrictions, and groundwater they would not have to address it. So that could get the development going quicker and cheaper. So finally, one other advantage is that the assessment and remediation activities under the VRP are limited to the boundaries of the site in the VRP. So this can also give some degree of certainty of getting through the investigation process, as there's no requirement to chase a contamination plume off site to define it to receive at least to receive the COC. So as I mentioned, it doesn't mean that the responsible party is no longer on the hook to address it. It just means that that would be addressed separate of the VRP process. All right, next. Okay, and so yeah, just for my last slide, just some pretty pictures. This is a recent project that utilized the VRP to help assist with the redevelopment site. This is actually the old Coca-Cola bottling site that I showed the sample map for earlier. As the remedy, which included a barrier, it was done, that was all kind of done as part of the redevelopment activities. So we did work close with the consultant and with the developer to kind of coordinate schedules, make sure the remedial action plan was approved by the time they were ready to put in the flooring and the vapor barrier and all that, but everything worked out. And previously, it was just an underutilized building that had been sitting vacant for a while. And now it's being redeveloped into affordable housing and community space for artists. So that's all I have. Rebecca, if you want to take it back.
All right. So just to kind of recap what we went over today and add in a couple little other tidbits of information. The voluntary remediation program, we just want to point out, it is voluntary. So if you apply for it, you get into it, you realize that this is going to require a lot more sampling on your site than you anticipated. It's too expensive. All of a sudden the timeline changed and you need to do things quicker. Something happens and you decide we need to get out of this. You can leave at any time. Whatever contamination is there will still need to be addressed underneath our regulatory program. But the voluntary remediation program is first and foremost voluntary. So you can enter it and come out as you would like. Again, it's based on the boundaries that the applicant defines for their site. So just kind of re-emphasizing that. That can save you a lot of time and money for getting the site back into reuse. If there's some type of plume that goes off-site, that can be very expensive to address. It can also be very time consuming. So this allows you to define the boundaries of your site, get that cleaned up, put it back into commerce, start generating some income, and then whoever the responsible party is can address the off-site contamination. Just wanted to emphasize the data analysis part, same as recap. There's no special voodoo that we do underneath the voluntary remediation program. You just have more data because you collect more samples to analyze the site as a whole. There is the option for the partial remediation for non-responsible parties. That can make all the difference in your cost of your cleanup. In being able to use an institutional or an engineering control. Like for example, the Haywalt galvanizing site I mentioned, there's no way that they would have had enough money to clean up the zinc contamination in the groundwater, but they were able to use a conveyance notice on that, make sure nobody actually uses that groundwater for drinking water, and that site was able to move forward. So that can make a big difference. And then you also get that certificate of completion and a release of liability for all past contamination for all the applicants that are listed in your application. So make sure if somebody is expecting that release of liability, they're listed as an applicant in your application. So some things to consider. There is that additional sampling during your investigation and the additional analysis. You know, that can increase the cost of your investigation. I know some clients are a little hesitant to move forward with that. But in exchange for that, if they are a non-responsible party, you have those more flexible cleanup options. You do have to, you know, remember there is a community notice for cleanups. Some people prefer to fly underneath the radar. If you're in the VRP underneath cleanup, that's not really an option. You do have to let the community know. And if it's a site that seems like there's a lot of community interest or somebody from the community requests it, there would also be a public meeting involved. Just a note on that, any of the comments that we receive, we only address the ones that deal with the environmental issues underneath the VRP. If it's related to the reuse, that's that we hand back to the applicants and make sure that they address that, but we're only concerned with comments related to the environmental investigation. And the final consideration is the timeline. There are some additional steps in there so that it looks like it's going to take extra time, especially if it's the cleanup. You do have that 30-day period for the public notice period. However, in some cases, it could actually help you because you have that more flexibility with the cleanup, so you don't have as long and drawn out of a cleanup as you might underneath our non-VRP program. So just some things to think about. That's the link to our voluntary remediation program page with additional questions. And just, you know, to touch on it again, so the VRP is a regulatory program that we use as a tool to help get sites back into reuse quicker. Brownfields funding mechanism that can pay for either a traditional recap investigation or a VRP investigation and cleanup. And I'm mentioning this especially right now because if you didn't notice, the infrastructure bill passed, which has an obscene amount of funding for brownfields. And some of that will be coming to the state. Some of it's going to come to our local partners. Some of it's going to come to the EPA regions. So for those of you that have a site that you think might benefit from the VRP, but your client or the applicant is getting sticker shock, if it's a vacant, abandoned, underutilized property, and they have a plan to redevelop that site, come talk to us. Because like I said, we're talking, I think it's something like $1 million a year. It's a crazy amount of funding that's going to be coming down. So come talk to us. We might have Brownfields funding available and can help with those costs, especially with the VRP investigation. Okay, so with that, I didn't see any questions come in through the Q&A. I don't see anybody raising their hand. Does anybody have an experience with the VRP site they wanted to share or any questions on what we went over today? We did just kind of want to demystify the process. I think because we haven't had as many VRP sites in the last few years. A lot of people are just concerned about it because it's just an unknown. So we wanted to demystify that process today and just kind of go over it, walk you through the steps, let you know that we're here to help you through that process. So any questions? Okay, I don't see any coming in. So we're going to close out the webinar. Jennifer and I are going to stay on for another about 5 minutes, just in case there are other questions that come in. Thank you again for joining us today. As I mentioned, the recording and the slides will be posted on LDEQ's YouTube page. Normally I try to get it up within 2 weeks, but Thanksgiving is coming up, so it might take a little bit longer. But we'll get those links out to you once those are posted. And if you have any questions in the future about the VRP, feel free to reach out to us. We're here to help you through this process.
Yes, definitely. Especially if you have a specific site and you're wondering about it, please give us a call. We can kind of go through it and talk it over with you.
Oh, Jen, this is a good question.
Oh,
Can bioremediation be used for a VRP site?
I don't see why not. There might be some monitoring requirements and things because the COC couldn't officially be issued until remedial goals would be met. I guess it would depend on what the remedial goal is set at. But yeah, it could definitely be used.
All right, Dwayne, I saw that you were typing. Do you want to unmute and provide
and speak?
No, I was going to say what Jennifer just said.
Yeah, it would be great to see bioremediation used more. I think that's a really great tool. There are still some unknowns with that, but we can definitely talk it through and see what some of the options are for that.
Right.
All right, I don't see any other questions coming in. Like I mentioned, Jennifer and I will hang out for a little bit longer. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll let you know about any other upcoming trainings. There's also LDEQ's Enviro School. If you haven't seen that already and you need the link, let us know and we'll send that over to you. Hopefully we will see you in the new year with a new set of trainings. We haven't set those up yet, but if there are topics you would like discussed, just let us know.